Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say, first of all, as a physician who's practiced 40 years, including cardiology, I can say that chocolate cake is good for you. But I don't recommend eating any in excess, nor do I recommend eating kale in excess either. That brings us to this. As a physician, I was always taught and still practice the fact that it's the scientific method that really leads us into progress, to do what is right for the future. Now, Mr. Huffman suggests that maybe it's consensus. And certainly there's been a suggestion here that maybe the courts should decide these things. But Professor Christie, enlighten us on this whole issue. What is the science and what is this 97%? My understanding about the 97%, it's often quoted that this is consensus rather than true settled science, is that this was 97% of colleagues who were asked the question. And certainly you're going to get any outcome you want as long as you ask the people that you choose to ask.
There were many failings with that study that came up with a 97%. One was how the sample was chosen.
Right.
Who did the decision about whether someone came on one side or the other. That was one of the problems with that. But when it comes to scientific method, I'm right with you. If we think we understand a system, then we have to be able to predict it. If we can't predict it, we don't understand it.
Yes.
The climate is clearly something we can't predict. Therefore, there is something very fundamental about the system we do not understand, as I've shown in the charts. And I think we have a long way to go.
Absolutely. So you show very clearly there that out of 102 different models, not a single one of them even comes close, it appears, to being accurate in predictability.
Yes, that should concern everyone in this committee.
Absolutely. So now we have tremendous amount of policy coming out of our government, out of governments around the world. And by the way, I believe it's Australia that actually repealed their cap and trade tax. So some of them, I think, are getting smart and actually looking at the science. So after all of these years and all of this policy and now cost to government and to free enterprise, to private businesses and individuals, we actually find out that all of that policy is based on what perhaps one could say is voodoo science. What would you say?
Well, I'd say the policy is based upon some theory that needs a whole lot of correction to it. But also, you should look at the numbers, too, about carbon emissions and coal burning and so on. No one is following the United States on this. Emissions are rising. I mentioned Germany and Japan. Their emissions are rising. They're building more coal-fired power plants. So no one really is following us. Look at the numbers. They will tell you the truth.
Well, what about this social cost thing now that's coming up, the social cost of carbon, and it was calculated. How was that number, how is that number calculated?
Now we're talking about voodoo, I think. But I'm familiar more with the inputs that are on the climate side. If the climate does this, I think it's basically the global temperature does this, then all these other factors are supposed to happen and theoretically happen. That's fundamentally the wrong input, because I've shown you that the input that is just based on the global temperature is already off by a good bit. So any of those downstream effects the social cost of carbon determines are going to be off.
So there's no way to truly calculate the offsetting taxation necessary in order to improve the climate outcomes when we first don't have the science, or the predictable science, in place to begin with.
Yeah, you're talking about an economic question. I probably am not an expert at all on that, but I would say since you start with a false or an erroneous input, you're not going to get a good answer at the end, no matter what else you do on the other
You basically have to make a number up and extrapolate from there, then, is what you're saying, in order to come up with any number, because you don't really have the science to prove what you can do economically with taxes and regulations that are actually going to mitigate climate change.
Right. We can test some of these things as I've done. Okay, let's shut down the United States. What would that effect be? So there are tests like that we can do, and they all show that these regulations and intents will just do nothing to whatever the climate's going to do.
Well, it just certainly appears to me that before we continue down this road, Mr. Chairman, of taxing individuals, taxing businesses, taxing our economy, and hyper-regulating our economy, killing jobs, flattening our economy even more than it is today, we should actually get the science right. With that, I'll yield back.